The galaxy burned with a silence more terrible than any war. Stars that had once blazed as beacons for the void now flickered faintly, as though afraid to cast their light upon the ruined worlds below. Across the endless black, ancient citadels lay broken, drifting through the cold void like the bones of dead gods. The Emperor of mankind stood upon the bridge of eternity, his golden figure still as the surface of a starless sea, and looked upon the ruin of all that had been promised. There was no victory here, only the illusion of endurance. Humanity's empire stretched across the stars, yet its foundations trembled. Beneath the facade of unity, whispers of betrayal curled like smoke through the halls of terror. In the hidden depths beneath the imperial palace, where the light of the stars could never reach, the Webway shuddered. A storm was coming, one not of flesh or steel, but of something older, darker, and far less forgiving. And in that storm stood the Emperor, alone. We who tell this story do not speak of him as legend nor as a god, but as a father, a ruler, a burdened soul. We speak of a man who bore the weight of eternity and found it far heavier than even he had foreseen. And to you, the one listening now, we care for you truly, in ways that words rarely touch. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. The Webway was the Emperor's secret, his salvation for mankind. It was to be a pathway through the immaterium, untouched by the tides of chaos, a bridge of light and safety in a galaxy drowning in madness. It would free humanity from the warp, from the endless risk of demonic corruption. But dreams that challenge the darkness are the first to be hunted by it. For centuries, the Emperor had labored in silence, building the imperial palace not merely as a seat of power, but as the entrance to something greater. Every golden wall, every titanic gate, was a shell wrapped around a truth so dangerous that even his most loyal sons were left ignorant. The custodes watched those halls with silent, unwavering vigilance, but even they could feel the tremor of something moving deep within. And so the great secret trembled, not from without, but from within. The Emperor stood over a great map of the galaxy, millions of systems marked as conquered, billions more unclaimed or in open rebellion. It was the greatest empire in the history of man, and yet in his mind's eye he saw only the cracks, the orcs on Armageddon, the Necron tombs stirring on the edges of forgotten worlds, the whispers of the ruinous powers moving like shadows across the dreams of his sons. It was not enough to command armies. It was not enough to forge unity. He would have to reshape reality itself to keep the species alive. That was the truth of immortality. Every solution was only a delay. Every triumph carried the seed of a greater war. He moved through the quiet of the palace, past endless columns and golden statues depicting victories from ages long past. He paused before one, a carving of himself, young and triumphant, a sword raised in one hand, the galaxy at his feet. It was a lie. The galaxy had never bowed willingly, and even now it bristled at his command. The Emperor's thoughts drifted, not to his enemies, but to his sons. His primarchs, scattered like seeds across the stars by the treachery of chaos, now slowly returning to his side. Each of them was a fragment of himself, and yet none of them could understand the burden he bore. Horus, ever loyal but impatient. Gilliman, dutiful but constrained by order. Magnus, brilliant but blinded by his belief that knowledge itself could tame the warp. They were his greatest triumphs, and they would be his greatest test. A custodian approached, bowing low. "My lord," the warrior said, his voice steady but edged with unease. The breach in the Webway corridor at Segmentum Tertius has widened. The Ordo Mechanicum cannot stabilize it. The Emperor's eyes flickered with restrained fire. He gave no outward sign of surprise. He had foreseen this moment long ago. Summon the Legio Custodes. Seal the breach. I will attend to it personally. The custodian bowed again, but his hesitation did not go unnoticed. There was fear in the eyes of even these warriors, men bred for loyalty without question. The Webway project had become more than just a secret. It had become a shadow that crept into every corner of the palace. As the Emperor descended into the depths, the air changed. The golden light of the palace gave way to the cold glow of ancient machinery. Runes older than the Imperium itself glowed faintly, their alien geometries twisting to the sight. The Webway portal pulsed like a living wound, its surface a whirl of shifting colors and impossible depth. Behind that gate, the future of humanity teetered on the edge of annihilation. He placed his hand upon the control seals. The machinery thrummed beneath his touch, recognizing the presence of its master. Yet even as he worked, he felt it. The push against the barrier, the claws of entities that had no name, no form, only hunger. The breach was not yet a wound, but it bled all the same. The Emperor's mind reached across the veil. He saw them there, demons, shapeless and infinite, drawn by the scent of a soul that shone brighter than 1,000 suns. He heard their voices, ancient and mocking. You cannot keep us out forever. All roads lead to the same place. He shut them out, his will an unbreakable wall. But in the silence that followed, doubt lingered, not in his purpose, but in the cost. Immortality was no shield against sacrifice. He sealed the breach, the portal's light dimming, until the chamber fell still once more. Yet he knew this was no victory, only a pause. Each battle won in the Webway drained resources, time, and strength. Each moment he spent below robbed him of time above, where his sons, his generals, and his empire waited. As he ascended from the depths, the Emperor paused once more at the threshold of the palace. He looked up at the sky of terror, its clouds lit faintly by the light of 1,000 orbiting warships. Somewhere out there, his empire expanded, but here, at the heart, its foundation shook. And he knew the truth. The Webway must be secured, no matter the cost. The Imperium could survive wars, rebellions, even betrayal. But if the Webway failed, it would not survive the long night to come. The Emperor turned toward the Hall of Concordance, where the High Lords waited for his presence. His steps were heavy, not from doubt, but from certainty. The path ahead was set. His journey was no longer one of conquest, but of preservation. And in the quiet of his mind, he wondered how much of himself would remain by the time it was done. The Hall of Concordance shimmered with false peace. Columns of white marble rose toward a gilded ceiling, each inlaid with fragments of crystal brought from the far edges of the Imperium. To the untrained eye, it was a place of unity, where the will of the Emperor flowed seamlessly into the governance of the realm. But those who lingered long enough could feel the tension hidden beneath the splendor, as though the walls themselves strained to contain the weight of unspoken truths. At the center of that chamber, the Emperor sat upon the throne of light. Not the golden throne that would come to define his fate, but the seat of rule, a symbol of authority that bound every lord, every primarch, and every servant of terror to his will. His gaze swept across the gathered figures, his voice calm as he heard their petitions, their reports, their fears. But he spoke little. Around him, his sons stood in varying degrees of silence and suspicion. Horus, War Master of the Imperium, regarded the proceedings with a steady but questioning look. Guilliman, the architect of empire, observed in silence, his mind likely already weighing the logistics of supply lines and the stability of border worlds. Magnus, ever the seeker of knowledge, watched his father with an intensity that bordered on challenge. The Emperor's silence was not ignorance. It was a wall, one built not out of pride, but necessity. The Webway project, the great salvation of mankind, was a secret even these godlike beings could not be trusted with. Not yet. But silence breeds questions, and questions left unanswered breed doubt. After the council's formalities ended, Horus approached first, as he always did. His voice was measured, but there was a heat beneath it. "Father," Horus said, bowing slightly, "the crusade pushes ever forward, but the demands on our fleets grow heavier. Resources are drawn to terror. To this," his gaze swept toward the hidden depths beneath the palace, "endeavor you have yet to name. The legions notice. They ask questions." The Emperor regarded him without anger, without warmth. "Their duty is to the Imperium, not to the questions it raises. The work here safeguards the crusade as surely as any fleet." Horus inclined his head, but his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. A soldier's loyalty was rarely in question. It was the patience of command that frayed first. When Horus departed, Magnus stepped forward. His crimson robes whispered across the marble, and his single great eye fixed on the Emperor. "You conceal much, father," Magnus said, his tone softer than Horus's but far more piercing. "I feel the tremors in the immaterium. The currents shift. There are storms that no mortal eye can see. And yet you remain here, beneath the palace, locked away from the very war you claim to guide." The Emperor's reply was measured, but there was steel beneath it. "The storms you feel are the reason I remain here, Magnus. What lies below cannot be left untended, not even for a moment. I trust you understand the weight of restraint." Magnus's gaze hardened, though his voice remained calm. "Restraint is a virtue, father, but ignorance is a danger. There are truths I could help you face, if only you would allow it." The Emperor turned from him. "In time, you will know what you must. Until then, your duty is to obey." Magnus bowed, but his mind was already working in silence. In the days that followed, the Primarchs returned to their duties, but the questions remained. The Emperor moved through the palace like a shadow of his own will, his presence felt but seldom explained. Each hour spent in the Webway was another hour away from the front, and the whispers among the High Lords began to deepen. Malcador, the Sigillite, was the only one permitted true access to the Emperor's thoughts in these days. The two would walk together in the hidden halls, their conversations low, their words echoing faintly from walls carved with sigils of both ancient human craft and alien geometry. "They grow restless," Malcador said one evening, as the two descended into the depths. "Your sons feel the weight of your absence, and the High Lords see only silence. Secrets are the mortar of empires, but too much, and the stone begins to crack." The Emperor's gaze remained fixed on the shimmering light of the Webway portal ahead. If they knew the truth of what lies beyond, they would do more than doubt. They would despair. "The Webway is their salvation, Malcador, but only if it is completed. I cannot risk distraction." Malcador studied him. "And if secrecy is the distraction?" The Emperor did not answer. In the depths of the palace, the Webway thrummed, its light steady for now, but the air carried the faint scent of ozone and ash. Custodians stood watch at every corridor, their golden armor reflecting the pale glow. They were silent sentinels, but even their discipline could not entirely conceal the unease that clung to this place. The Emperor approached the portal, his mind reaching beyond its veil. He felt the pressure building, like a tide held back by walls of thought and will. It was holding, but only just. The demons pressed against the barrier, not with force alone, but with whispers, with temptation, promises of power, of peace, of endings. He shut them out. In the silence of his mind, the Emperor reflected not on the enemy, but on his sons. Horus's loyalty, Magnus's curiosity, Gilliman's precision, all of them necessary, all of them dangerous in their own way. He had shaped them to be perfect, and in doing so, he had made them dangerous. For perfection cannot help but see imperfection in others, even in its maker. On the surface, the Imperium marched ever onward. New worlds were brought into compliance, alien threats crushed beneath the might of the legions. But beneath it all, the Emperor could feel the tremors. Not yet collapse, but the shifting of foundations. And he knew that if the Webway failed, no number of victories above would matter. In the days that followed, Magnus sent word from his legion, reports framed as updates, but laced with questions. Observations of psychic disturbances, of warp anomalies, of omens. Horus too sent word, his messages more direct, asking for guidance in matters that could have been delegated, as though seeking to draw his father into conversation. The Emperor answered little. In his silence, the seeds of doubt began to grow. Not outright rebellion, no, not yet, but the slow, creeping suspicion that would one day become something far greater. And in the quiet of the Webway chamber, the Emperor stood alone, his golden form lit by the pale shimmer of the portal, and he wondered how much longer the walls could hold, both here and within the hearts of those he had created to serve him. The surface of Prospero was quiet beneath the light of its dying sun. Spires of crystalline architecture reached into the pale sky, glimmering faintly like shards of a broken dream. At the heart of the city of Tizca, Magnus the Red walked alone, his great form silhouetted against the glassy domes of the pyramid of Photep. His single eye scanned the horizon, but it was not the beauty of his homeworld he sought. It was the shadows beyond it. The warp was uneasy. He could feel it in the stillness of the air, in the faint ripple beneath reality's skin. The Emperor's project in the Webway resonated like a distant chord through the immaterium, but it was a song laced with discord. Magnus had tried to put the unease aside, trusting in his father's judgment, but silence had its own gravity. He stood in the grand observatory at the pyramid's peak, gazing into the shifting skein of the immaterium. Runes of warding glowed softly around him, their shapes ancient and precise. Behind him, his chief librarian, Ahriman, approached in silence. "My lord," Ahriman said, bowing his head, "the legions grow restless. Your brothers call for unity, yet the Emperor remains withdrawn upon terror. Rumors spread." Magnus's expression hardened. Rumors grow in the absence of truth. My father keeps his counsel, but there is purpose in his silence. And if his silence hides danger? Ahriman asked carefully. The currents in the warp grow strong. There are storms forming in places long still. Perhaps it is. Magnus turned, his single eye burning with restrained power. You believe I have not felt them? I feel every ripple in the immaterium, Ahriman. I know the storms are growing. But my father has commanded restraint. I will not betray his trust. Yet even as he spoke the words, they felt brittle in his mouth. When Ahriman departed, Magnus turned back to the skein. The threads of fate shimmered and twisted, slipping through his grasp no matter how he reached for them. He saw flashes, an endless throne, a golden figure bound in fire, a palace beneath the earth that burned without flame. He saw demons pressing at unseen gates, and he heard the voices of the warp whispering, "The walls are thin." The vision faded, leaving him alone in silence. On Terra, the Emperor's work continued without pause. The Webway portal burned steadily, but each day the pressure against it grew. Demons tested the barrier with greater strength, seeking weaknesses in both structure and will. The custodes held their posts without falter, their golden forms unmoving, but the Emperor felt the strain growing. In a rare moment of quiet, he allowed himself to think of Magnus. The Crimson King's gifts were unmatched, his mastery of the warp greater than any other, and yet those very gifts made him dangerous. Magnus believed that knowledge was the path to salvation, but the Emperor knew better. Knowledge without limits was a road to ruin. Still, in the depths of the Webway chamber, the Emperor hesitated. Could Magnus be the key to stabilizing what even the Mechanicum could not fully understand, or would his intervention hasten disaster? The decision was left unspoken. Far across the galaxy, Magnus continued his studies. But with each passing day, the unease gnawed deeper. Reports from other librarians spoke of strange psychic echoes, as if the warp itself was calling to him. His dreams were filled with images of terror, of a golden gate, of his father's voice, not speaking but warning. At last, Magnus could bear it no longer. In the silence of the Pyramid of Photep, he descended into the great librarium. Tomes older than the Imperium lined the endless shelves, and the air was thick with the scent of ancient dust and ozone. Ahriman waited there, silent but watchful. "My lord," Ahriman said quietly, "you have made your decision." Magnus said nothing. He stepped to the great central dais, his clawed hands resting upon the crystalline controls. Runes flared to life, casting the chamber in crimson light. The skein unfolded before him, its threads twisting into patterns only he could fully perceive. He reached out, not toward the warp in its raw, dangerous form, but toward the distant light of terror. He sought to see what was hidden, to glimpse the truth his father would not share. The visions came hard and fast. The Webway burned with light, its corridors filled with warriors locked in endless battle. Demons clawed at the gates, their forms shifting and impossible. And at the center, the Emperor stood, his golden armor dimmed, his will straining to hold back a tide that could not be fully stopped. Magnus staggered, the force of the vision striking deep into his mind. He saw more, the golden throne, not as a seat of power, but as a prison. The Imperium above, vast and blind, ruled in his father's name while the truth was buried beneath the palace. He pulled back, his chest heaving, the chamber spinning around him. Ahriman stepped forward, concern in his eyes. "What did you see, my lord?" Magnus looked at him, his single eye burning with both fear and resolve. "I saw the truth. The Emperor fights a war none of us were meant to see. And if he falls, the Imperium will fall with him." Ahriman hesitated. "Then we must act." "No," Magnus said sharply. "Not yet. To act without understanding is to risk everything. But..." His voice trailed off, heavy with the weight of inevitability. "If my father will not speak, I will watch. And when the time comes, I will intervene, whether he wills it or not." On Terra, the Emperor paused in his work. For a moment, he felt a ripple, faint but familiar, through the warp. Magnus's presence brushed against the veil, distant but undeniable. His eyes narrowed. He knew then that silence alone would not hold his son at bay. The threads of fate tightened. The depths beneath the imperial palace were alive with war. The Webway, once a gleaming labyrinth of light and stability, now shuddered beneath the pounding of 1,000 unseen hands. Its corridors, forged by an ancient race, long vanished from the galaxy, cracked and splintered beneath the pressure of the immaterium. Where once golden light had filled the halls, shadows now clung to the edges, whispering with voices older than stars. The Legio Custodes advanced in perfect formation, their golden armor reflecting the pale glow of the Webway's crystalline walls. Each step was measured, each strike precise, but still the enemy pressed on. Demons, shapes without shape, swarmed the passages, their claws scraping against reality as they sought purchase in a world that would not fully admit them. And at the center of it all, the Emperor of mankind fought. His power burned like a star, casting back the tide of the warp with a will no mortal could endure. His blade, more thought than metal, carved through the diamonds, severing their forms from the fragile threads that bound them here. Each fell screaming into the void, their voices fading into the endless howling of the immaterium. But for every one destroyed, another emerged. He stood at the heart of a breach, the golden halo of his psychic might, holding the gap closed by sheer force. Custodians fought to reinforce the wards. Mechanicum's servitors labored at control stations, their mechanical chants echoing strangely in the endless corridors. Stabilization is incomplete, one Magos reported, its voice flat and devoid of fear. The barrier will fail again within 22 minutes unless reinforced. The Emperor's eyes did not move from the breach. It will hold. The Magos bowed, but in its mechanical mind, it knew what the Emperor did not say. It will hold, because I am here to hold it. Hours passed like seconds in the endless light of battle. When at last the breach was sealed, the Emperor withdrew, his golden form dimmed by the strain. Yet no mortal could see the true cost. Not in flesh, for his was beyond mortal weakness, but in will. Immortality had not freed him from exhaustion. It had merely made his exhaustion eternal. In the quiet that followed, he walked the silent halls of the Webway, the walls humming faintly with power. Every corridor was another burden, every sealed breach another reminder that victory here was not a matter of triumph, but of endurance. In his solitude, he reflected on the truth he had long known, but seldom allowed himself to dwell upon. Immortality was not the freedom to endure forever. It was the sentence to fight battles that could never be fully won. Above, the Imperium thrived, or so it seemed. New worlds bent the knee, fleets expanded. The legions carried the light of terror into the dark. But the Emperor knew the truth. Every resource poured into the crusade was one less he could draw upon here, where the true war was being fought. He ascended from the depths, his golden armor still gleaming, but faintly shadowed by dust, and the lingering scent of ozone. Malcador waited for him in the Hall of Seals, his face drawn with the strain of carrying the weight of the Imperium in the Emperor's absence. "You have been below for 3 days," Malcador said, his voice carefully neutral. "The High Lords grow anxious. There are matters of governance that require your hand, or at least your presence." The Emperor's gaze was distant. "Their matters will wait. The Webway will not." Malcador studied him for a long moment. "Your sons ask questions as well. Horus sends word daily. Gilliman demands updates for the stability of supply routes. And Magnus," his voice faltered. "Magnus watches." The Emperor's eyes flickered with restrained light. "Magnus is dangerous, but his danger comes from love. It will be his undoing." "And yours?" Malcador asked quietly. The Emperor did not answer. In the depths of the Webway, the war did not cease. Each day brought new breaches, each sealed corridor another that trembled. The demons were learning, adjusting, their formless minds probing for weaknesses not of stone or metal, but of will. The custodes fought without rest, their numbers slowly thinning. Even these, golden warriors, bred for perfection, could not fight endlessly. They did not complain, but the Emperor could feel their silent devotion hardening into grim resolve. They would die here if needed, and they would not question why. In a rare moment of quiet, the Emperor stood upon a high platform, gazing out across the endless expanse of the Webway. Its corridors stretched in every direction, some lit faintly, others darkened, their power drained by the constant war. He remembered the dream he had once carried, the Webway as a shining road for humanity, a path of safety beyond the warp's reach. That dream was now a battlefield. He thought of the ages he had walked the galaxy, long before the Imperium, before the unification of Terra, before even the idea of mankind's dominion over the stars. He had seen countless civilizations rise and fall, and now, for the first time, he wondered if humanity's empire would be different, or if it too would burn in time. But there was no room for doubt. Doubt was a luxury for those who could afford failure. The Emperor could not fail. As he turned from the platform, another custodian approached. "My lord," the warrior said, his voice steady, "the enemy presses at the eastern gate. Your presence is requested." The Emperor nodded once, and together they descended deeper into the golden halls. There was no rest, not here, not ever. The vengeful spirit hung in orbit above the war-scarred world of Carthay, its titanic frame casting a shadow across the burning cities below. Horus Lupercal stood upon the strategium deck, his eyes fixed on the holographic projection of the battle. Legion icons shifted across the map, the lunar wolves pressing the enemy into retreat. Every movement was precise, every maneuver flawless. The war was being won, and yet there was no satisfaction in him. Victory felt muted. Not because the foe was unworthy, but because the victory rang hollow without the presence of the Emperor at his side. Horus had been made War Master not merely to lead the crusade, but to embody the will of Terra itself. And yet, the will of Terra was silent. He turned from the projection as Captain Loken approached, his armor still bearing the dust of battle. "My lord," Loken said, bowing his head, "Carthay is nearly pacified. The last pockets of resistance will fall within the day." "Well done, Captain," Horus said, his voice calm but distant. "Prepare the next phase. We move quickly. The crusade does not wait for politics." Loken hesitated before speaking again. "There is talk among the officers, my lord. They wonder why the Emperor remains on Terra. They say," Horus's gaze sharpened. "They say what?" "That his absence is more than duty," Loken said carefully. "That there are secrets, projects hidden even from you." Horus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained measured. "The Emperor has his reasons. Our duty is to obey." Yet even as he said the words, the doubt whispered at the edge of his thoughts. When Loken departed, Horus remained alone in the strategium. The silence was heavy. He looked at the throne upon which the Emperor had once sat during the great councils, remembered the presence that had filled every hall, every battle. That presence was gone now, replaced by silence and distance. It was in that silence that whispers found their way in. They were not the howling of the warp. No, Horus would have recognized such corruption immediately. These were quieter, subtler. A suggestion, a question. Why are you left to fight these wars alone? On Terra, Malcador felt the ripples. The sigillite stood in his private chambers, gazing at the map of the Imperium. The bonds between the Primarchs and the Emperor were strong, but silence frayed even the strongest ties. Horus's loyalty was beyond question, for now, but Malcador knew that loyalty left untended could turn to resentment. He approached the Emperor in the depths beneath the palace. "Horus asks for you," Malcador said quietly. "He does not say it, but the weight is growing. The crusade stretches thin, and the legions are beginning to feel abandoned." The Emperor's gaze remained fixed upon the Webway portal. "Horus was made War Master because he can bear the weight. My presence would change nothing here, and it cannot be spared from the work below. Even a shadow of your presence would quiet the questions," Malcador pressed. The Emperor turned to him, and in his eyes was the endless depth of a will that could not be moved. "Questions are a luxury. The Webway is necessity. I cannot leave." Malcador bowed his head, but in his mind he could see the cracks forming. Far from Terra, Horus stood at the viewing deck of the vengeful spirit, the stars stretching before him. His thoughts were heavy, his memories drawn back to the moment the Emperor had named him War Master. The pride he had felt then was sharp and clear. But now, that pride felt like a chain. He thought of his brothers, Guilliman with his endless planning, Magnus with his cryptic warnings, Perturabo with his cold calculations. Each of them fought their wars, but none bore the burden Horus carried. And above them all, the Emperor sat in silence. It was in that silence that Horus began to speak less of terror in his councils. The war became his war. The crusade became his crusade. And though he did not see it yet, that distinction was the first step upon a road that could not be walked back. On Terra, the Emperor sealed another breach in the Webway. His golden form shone in the pale light, the demons clawing at the barrier dissolving beneath his will. Yet even in victory, there was no triumph, only the certainty that another breach would follow. As he withdrew from the portal, he felt another ripple, distant, faint, but tinged with something dangerous. Horus's thoughts brushed against the warp, not in corruption, but in unrest. The Emperor frowned, but turned back to his work. There was no time to address it. And so, the silence continued. The winds above Prospero's white towers carried no sound, no hint of the war being waged across the stars. The spires of Tizca shimmered beneath the pale sunlight, their mirrored surfaces reflecting a world at peace. Yet within the pyramid of Photep, the Crimson King felt no peace. Magnus stood at the center of the great librarium, the air around him heavy with the scent of ozone and parchment. Scrolls and tomes older than the Imperium lay open, runes shifting faintly across their surfaces as if unwilling to remain still beneath his gaze. His single great eye burned with strain. He had been watching the skein again. Threads of fate stretched out before him, twisting into patterns both intricate and fragile. He had seen Horus, standing alone upon the bridge of the vengeful spirit, pride hardening into isolation. He had seen the Emperor, deep beneath terror, his golden light dimmed by the strain of holding the Webway shut. And between them, he had seen the faint shimmer of something moving in the dark. "My lord," Ahriman said quietly from the edge of the chamber. He had learned not to interrupt Magnus when the skein was open. His voice was careful, respectful. "The visions trouble you." Magnus turned slowly. "They are not visions, Ahriman. They are warnings. Horus walks a path that grows darker each day. And my father buries himself beneath terror, leaving the galaxy to wonder." "Then speak to him," Ahriman said. If you fear for Horus, if you fear for the Imperium, tell the Emperor what you have seen. Magnus looked away, his gaze returning to the shifting threads. You think I have not tried? His silence is a wall no words can break. Even when I reach through the warp, his presence is closed to me. Ahriman hesitated. Then perhaps the warp is the way to reach him. Magnus said nothing, but in his mind the thought took root. He had sworn to obey his father's command to avoid certain paths of sorcery, but the Webway War was no small matter. If Horus was to be saved, if the Imperium was to endure, perhaps obedience was a lesser virtue than action. Far across the galaxy, Horus led the Lunar Wolves in victory after victory, yet each triumph left him feeling further from terror. He no longer sent as many messages to the Emperor. Fewer still were answered. In his councils, his voice had grown sharper, his decisions less tempered by the thought of his father's will. It was in these moments that Magnus felt the skein tightening. Threads of possibility drew closer to a single point, a point of change, of betrayal, of ruin. In the quiet of his chambers, Magnus sat before the great mirror of the librarium. Its surface shimmered faintly, reflecting not his form, but the endless tides of the warp. He reached out, his hand brushing the surface. The ripples spread, and with them came the voices. They were not demons, not yet. These were echoes, remnants of possibilities, fragments of thought caught in the currents of the immaterium. He ignored them, his mind fixed on a single path. Through the mirror, he saw terror. The imperial palace rose in endless golden towers, the light of the Astronomicon burning above it. Beneath, he felt the deep hum of the Webway, and deeper still, he felt the Emperor's presence, vast, endless, distant. He tried to call out, his voice carrying through the warp. "Father, hear me." There was no answer. The silence pressed in around him, heavy as stone. Magnus's eye burned as he focused harder, his will reaching deeper, pushing against the wards that guarded the Emperor's mind. He felt them resist, the golden light hardening, but still he pushed. For a moment, he felt the faintest flicker, an image of the Webway, the golden light straining against the darkness. The Emperor's form surrounded by enemies only he could hold at bay. And then the vision was gone, the wards slamming shut. Magnus staggered back, his breath heavy. The mirror's surface darkened, the warp's voices retreating to whispers. "My lord," Ahriman said, stepping forward. "What did you see?" Magnus's voice was quiet, but heavy with certainty. "I saw enough. The Emperor cannot hold forever, and if he will not speak to me, I will find another way to reach him." On Terra, in the depths beneath the palace, the Emperor paused. For a moment, he felt the faint touch of Magnus's mind pressing against the wards. His expression darkened. "Magnus," he murmured to himself, "do not walk this path." But the skein of fate was already moving. Webway shuddered like a living thing. In its endless corridors, the light that once burned clear now flickered, dimming in places as the strain grew. Demons pressed at the gates with renewed ferocity, their forms writhing against the golden wards, their voices hissing promises into the cracks between reality and thought. The Emperor stood at the center of the largest breach yet, his psychic will flaring like a sun. The Legio Custodes fought at his flanks, their halberds flashing in perfect arcs. Each blow cast a demon back into the void, but still the enemy came on. The breach was not merely an attack, it was a siege. "Seal the northern corridor," the Emperor commanded, his voice resonating like thunder. "No passage must be allowed." The custodes obeyed without question. Servitors chanted in machine code. the sigils of ancient wards flaring along the walls. The Mechanicum adepts worked with desperate precision, their mechadendrites sparking as the Webway's power conduits were forced beyond their limits. Still, the breach strained. In the briefest moment of stillness, the Emperor felt the faint echo of something else. Not demon, not warp storm, but distant. It was a thread brushing against his wards. He knew the presence. Magnus. But there was no time to respond. The breach flared again, and the Emperor poured his will into the barrier. Above Terra, the Imperium remained blind to the true scale of the war. Fleets moved, worlds bent the knee. The legions fought and bled across the stars. Horus Lupercal stood upon the bridge of the vengeful spirit, victory once more at hand. And yet, with each conquest, the silence from Terra weighed heavier. He met with his captains in the Strategium, the air thick with the scent of oil and victory. Loken spoke first. Another compliance secured, my lord. The resistance was heavier than expected, but the legion held strong. Good, Horus said, his voice even. Prepare the fleet to move on. We do not linger. Captain Abaddon stepped forward, his expression harder. We move on without word from Terra again. The Emperor has left the crusade in your hands, brother, yet he offers neither guidance nor answer. Horus's jaw tightened. The Emperor trusts me to lead. That is enough. But the words rang hollow. That night, in the quiet of his chambers, Horus stared at the stars. He remembered the moment the Emperor had placed the mantle of War Master upon him, the pride he had felt in that moment. But pride alone did not bridge the silence that had grown in the years since. It was in that silence that the first whispers came. They were not the roaring voices of the warp. No, these were softer, almost careful. A thought, not his own, brushing against the edges of his mind. You are the son who carries the weight of the Imperium. Horus ignored it. At first. On Prospero, Magnus stood again in the great librarium, the skein of fate unfurling before him. The threads twisted tighter now, moving toward a point he could no longer ignore. He saw Horus's path bending, the Emperor's light dimming beneath Terra, the Webway straining toward collapse. My lord, Ahriman said from the shadows, you have seen something again. Magnus's voice was quiet, but his eye burned. I have seen a choice, one that must be made soon, or all will be lost. You would act against the Emperor's command? Ahriman asked. I would act to save him, Magnus replied, even if he will not see the danger, even if he would forbid it. Ahriman hesitated. Then the path you choose will not be without cost. Magnus turned from the skein. No path worth walking ever is. In the depths beneath Terra, the Emperor stood alone in the Webway chamber, the breach sealed for now. The silence was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the portal. Malcador approached quietly. The war above continues, Malcador said, but the war here, it grows worse by the day. The Emperor's gaze remained fixed on the portal. It will hold. For how long? Malcador pressed. The Emperor did not answer. Far from Terra, in the quiet of his flagship, Horus stood again at the viewing deck, the stars reflected in his eyes. The whispers came again, soft, insistent. You are the hand that shapes the Imperium now. Do you not deserve to know why you are left alone? Horus said nothing, but the silence between his thoughts and the voice grew shorter, and across the galaxy, Magnus prepared to act. The pyramid of Photep was silent beneath the night skies of Prospero. The city below slept, unaware that its master stood on the edge of a choice that would decide its fate. Magnus the Red paced the great librarium, his massive form casting long shadows across the ruined floor. The skein of fate had grown tighter, its threads drawing toward a singular, inevitable point. He had watched Horus's path darken, had seen the Emperor's light dim beneath terror, and had felt the growing storms in the warp. He could no longer stand idle. Ahriman entered quietly, the air stirring with the faint scent of parchment and ozone. "My lord," he said softly, "the council awaits your word. They know you are preparing something forbidden." Magnus turned, his single eye burning like a star. "The Emperor forbade us from walking certain paths, but he forbade them because they are dangerous, not because they are useless. And now danger is upon us all. I will speak to him, whether he wills it or not." Ahriman hesitated. "The method you intend, it will not go unnoticed. The Webway is shielded for a reason. To breach it, even in thought, is to risk." Magnus raised a hand, silencing him. "I know the risk, but if Horus falls, the Imperium falls. And if the Webway collapses, the Imperium will burn. I will not stand idle and watch." The librarium's great mirror loomed before him, its surface shimmering faintly with the currents of the warp. Magnus stepped onto the central dais, runes flaring to life beneath his feet. The chamber filled with a low hum, the air thickening as power gathered. In the warp, the currents swelled, parting before Magnus's will. His mind reached across the void, past the fleets and worlds, past the veil of the immaterium itself. He sought terror, the Emperor's presence, the golden light that had guided him since the day he had been created. The wards of the Webway burned against him. Golden sigils flared, the Emperor's psychic defenses resisting his intrusion. Magnus pressed harder, his will a spear of fire against the wall of light. For a heartbeat, he felt the faintest touch, the Emperor's mind, vast and infinite. But the contact was not gentle. The wards shuddered beneath his assault, the carefully wrought protections bending under the force of his will. And then something broke. A sound like shattering glass echoed across the immaterium. The wards cracked, a rent tearing open within the Webway itself. Through that tear came a flood, demonic shapes pouring into the golden corridors, their voices rising in a howling chorus of triumph. On terror, deep beneath the palace, the Emperor staggered. The Webway portal flared wildly, the wards flickering as the breach widened. Demons clawed at the opening, their forms forcing their way into reality. Custodes surged forward, their halberds flashing, but the tide was already upon them. Above the breach, Magnus's voice echoed, his warning carried across the warp. "Father, Horus walks a path that will destroy you. The Webway." His words were cut short as the Emperor's voice thundered back, his fury a blade of light. "Magnus, what have you done?" The Crimson King felt the weight of that voice strike him like a hammer. He staggered, his great form trembling beneath the force of the Emperor's will. "I sought to save you," Magnus cried. "To save us all. You have doomed us," the Emperor's voice roared. The connection broke, the Emperor's light slamming the breach shut, but the damage was done. The wards had been compromised, the Webway's stability shattered. The war below terror would now be fought not in controlled corridors, but in halls overrun by demonic hosts. In the depths, the Emperor turned to Malkador. His voice was cold, his fury restrained only by necessity. "Magnus has broken the wards. He has opened the Webway to the warp. We will have to seal it, no matter the cost." Malkador's face was pale, but he nodded. "And Magnus?" The Emperor's expression darkened. "Magnus will answer for this. Prospero will answer for this." On Prospero, Magnus sank to his knees, the mirror's surface darkening to black. Ahriman stepped forward cautiously. "My lord, what has happened?" Magnus's voice was hollow. "I have warned him, but in doing so, I have brought the war to his gates." In that moment, the Crimson King knew that the Emperor's judgment would come, and when it did, Prospero would burn. The Webway screamed. The golden halls beneath the imperial palace, once pristine, were now a battlefield of ruin. Where Magnus's psychic blow had torn through the wards, the demons poured in like a flood, their forms writhing and shifting as they clawed their way into reality. The Emperor stood at the center of the chaos, his golden form blazing with light that turned the shadows to ash. Each sweep of his blade banished a dozen horrors, but still they came. The Legio Custodes fought in perfect discipline, their ranks unbroken even as the enemy surged against them. The breach could not be undone. "Hold the gate," the Emperor commanded, his voice resonating like a thunderclap. "No demon may pass." Malcador stood nearby, his own psychic strength reinforcing the wards where they still held. Sweat beaded on his brow, his voice steady as he chanted words older than human civilization. "The breach spreads, my lord. We cannot contain it indefinitely." The Emperor's gaze was cold and unyielding. "Then we will contain it long enough to seal it." Hours passed like moments, the battle in the Webway stretching into eternity. When at last the demonic tide faltered, the Emperor summoned his custodes and mechanicum adepts. The air in the chamber still burned with the stench of ozone and blood, the walls scarred with claw marks that glowed faintly with warp fire. Malcador approached, his voice low. "It is as we feared. The wards are compromised beyond repair. The Webway cannot be completed, not as you intended." The Emperor's face was unreadable, but in his voice there was a weight that even Malcador could hear. "The dream of a safe road for mankind is ended. Now we must build a prison instead." Malcador's gaze lingered on him. "And Magnus?" The Emperor's eyes hardened. "Magnus has betrayed my command. His arrogance has brought this ruin upon us. Prospero will answer for this." Above terror, word spread in whispers. The custodes carried orders in silence. The mechanicum adepts of the palace redoubled their efforts to stabilize the Golden Throne. No longer a gateway to a shining path for humanity, but now a lock to keep the warp at bay. Far from terror, the space wolves received their summons. Lemon Russ, the Wolf King, read the Emperor's orders in silence, his expression grim. His warriors stood ready, their weapons freshly honed. "You have your orders," Russ said at last, his voice cold as ice. "Prospero is to be brought to heel. Magnus is to be judged." On Prospero, the Crimson King stood in his tower, the weight of what he had done settling upon him like stone. He had saved nothing. His warning had reached the Emperor, but not in time to prevent the disaster. And now he felt the tremor in the skein, a thread of fate pulling taut, drawing inexorably toward Prospero's destruction. Ahriman entered quietly, his face drawn. "The currents in the warp shift, my lord. The legions move, and the skein, it narrows." Magnus turned to the great mirror. "I know. The Emperor comes for me. Not himself, but through his executioner." "You mean Russ?" Ahriman said quietly. Magnus's single eye closed for a long moment. When he opened it again, his voice was heavy with resolve. "If Russ comes, Prospero will burn. But we will not flee. This world is our home. If we must answer for my choice, then we will answer here." In the warp, the current swirled around the skein of fate. Magnus could see the path ahead. Russ's fleet, the flames, the ruin. There was no path where Prospero was spared. But there were still choices to be made, and Magnus would not make them in fear. On Terra, the Emperor stood alone in the Webway chamber, the light of the golden throne flickering faintly behind him. Malcador lingered nearby, his voice quiet. "You send Russ to Prospero, knowing what will come." "I send Russ because Magnus must be stopped," the Emperor replied. "If Magnus had trusted me, this would not have been necessary. But now, the price will be paid." Malcador hesitated. "And the price is Prospero." The Emperor's gaze turned to the portal, his golden light casting long shadows across the chamber. "The price is whatever it must be." Far from Terra, the Space Wolves' fleet burned toward Prospero, and in the quiet halls of Tisga, Magnus waited. The skies above Prospero were clear, a perfect blue stretching over the shining towers of Tisga. The city's mirrored spires glittered like jewels, their surfaces reflecting the sun. But beyond that serene beauty, the void burned with the approach of war. The Space Wolves' fleet tore through the warp, their warships a pack of steel predators. At their head was the Hrafnkel, the flagship of Lehman Russ, its great wolf-headed prow gleaming in the starlight. Within its command deck, Russ stood silent, his massive frame leaning over the hololithic display of Prospero. His warriors stood around him, grim, armored, their eyes lit by the promise of battle. They did not question their orders. The Emperor's word was law, and the judgment had been passed. Russ broke the silence. "Magnus was my brother, but the Emperor has named him traitor. We will do what must be done." The wolves growled their assent. On Prospero, the Crimson King stood at the high balcony of the Pyramid of Photep, his gaze sweeping over the city below. Tisga was alive with movement, scholars, warriors, and civilians alike preparing for what was to come. The thousand suns had seen the space wolves approach in the skein. They knew war was coming. Ahriman approached, his voice low. "The wolves are close. We will not be able to stop them with words." Magnus's single eye closed briefly. "I know. Russ will not listen. His orders are clear." "Then we must prepare to defend ourselves," Ahriman urged. Magnus turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Our defense will not save Prospero. It will only decide how we fall." Ahriman hesitated. "Then why fight?" "Because Prospero is our home," Magnus said quietly. "And because even in ruin, there is dignity in defiance." The city prepared for war. Ranks of the thousand suns stood ready in their crimson armor, their helms gleaming in the sunlight. Psychic wards were drawn across the spires, shimmering faintly as the librarians of the Legion strengthened their defenses. From the towers of Tisga, the great crystal lenses turned toward the sky, focusing the psychic might of the thousand suns into a shield that shimmered faintly above the city. It would not hold forever, but it would hold long enough for the wolves to bleed for every step. In the void, the Space Wolves' fleet closed the distance. The Hrafnkel's bridge hummed with energy as the warships readied their weapons. Russ stood at the center of it all, his expression cold as ice. He remembered Magnus, not as a traitor, but as a brother who had once stood beside him. The memory weighed heavily, but the Emperor's word was not to be questioned. Russ's loyalty was not to Magnus, it was to the Emperor. As the Wolves' fleet entered orbit, Prospero's defenses flared to life. Batteries of ground-based weapons turned toward the sky, their fire lancing out in streaks of light. Orbital defenses awoke, their guns booming as they hurled fire into the void. Russ gave the order. "Engage!" The void above Prospero lit with war. The wolves' ships exchanged fire with the planetary defenses, their torpedoes burning trails of light as they cut toward the surface. Drop pods filled with space wolves roared from the bays of the Hrafnkel, streaking toward the city below. In Tizca, the alarms sounded. The skies darkened with the descent of the wolves. Magnus stood upon the highest spire of the pyramid, his gaze fixed upon the approaching storm. He could feel Russ's presence, familiar, grim, inevitable. Ahriman came to stand beside him. "They come, my lord." "Shall we meet them in the air?" Magnus's voice was quiet. "Number, we will meet them here. Prospero will stand." The first of the wolves' drop pods slammed into the outskirts of the city, their hatches bursting open as armored warriors poured forth. Bolters roared, their shells tearing into the stone and steel of Tizca's lower districts. The 1,000 Suns met them in the streets, their bolters answering in kind, their psychic powers turning the very air into a weapon. Lightning crackled from their hands. Firestorms swept through the avenues, and the ground itself rose to swallow the wolves' advance. Above it all, the city burned with light, beautiful, terrible, and doomed. In orbit, Russ watched the battle unfold. His voice was cold. "Bring me Magnus." And in the heart of the pyramid, Magnus prepared to meet his brother. The first impact shook Tizca to its foundation. Space wolves' drop pods tore open the skies like falling meteors, slamming into the marble streets with bone-shattering force. The impact sent shockwaves through the city, toppling spires and shattering mirrored glass into clouds of diamond dust. From the ruptured pods, the wolves emerged. Grey-armored warriors, their pauldrons marked with the snarling wolf of Fenris. They came howling into the streets, their chainswords roaring, their bolters spitting death. The 1,000 Suns met them in disciplined ranks, their crimson armor gleaming in the burning light. They did not roar or howl. They fought in silence, their bolters cracking in perfect unison, their psychic power woven into every volley. Bolter fire tore through the streets, the air thick with smoke and burning crystal. Psychic storms burst above the rooftops, sheets of emerald lightning, waves of blue flame that rolled over the wolves' advance. But the wolves did not falter. Leman Russ descended at the forefront, his drop pod carving a crater into the plaza of glass. He emerged like a beast unchained, his armor scarred from countless wars, his frost blade in hand. His eyes burned with a cold fury, not at the battle itself, but at the betrayal he had been sent to answer. "Magnus!" his voice thundered, echoing across the burning city. "Face your judgment!" In the pyramid of Photep, Magnus heard his brother's call. He stood at the utter center of the great hall, the floor beneath him inlaid with runes that burned faintly in the light of the fires outside. The city was falling, but there was no panic in him, only a deep, heavy sorrow. Ahriman approached, his armor scorched from battle. The wolves pushed deeper into the city. Our lines are holding, for now, but the cost is great. Magnus's single eye lingered on the burning skyline beyond the balcony. "There is no victory here, Ahriman, only the manner of our fall." Ahriman hesitated. "Then meet him. Russ will not stop until he has faced you." Magnus turned, his massive form moving with a slow, deliberate grace. So be it. The streets of Tizca became rivers of fire. 1,000 Suns fought from the steps of burning towers, their psychic blasts cutting through the wolves in waves. But for every warrior that fell, another took his place. The wolves fought with savage endurance, their fury driving them deeper into the city with every passing moment. Civilians fled toward the inner districts, their mirrored robes trailing embers as they ran. The air was choked with the smell of ozone and burning crystal. The mirrored spires that had once made Tizca a city of light now reflected only fire. Russ cut his way through the defenders with brutal efficiency, his frost blade cleaving through armor and stone alike. Around him, the wolf guard advanced, their axes and blades striking down any who stood in their path. At last, Russ reached the steps of the Pyramid of Photep. His boots struck the marble with heavy, echoing thuds as he climbed, the fires of the city at his back. The great doors opened before him, and there stood Magnus. The Crimson King loomed above his brother, his single eye burning with restrained power. "Russ," he said, his voice deep and calm, "you have come far." Russ's blade tightened in his grip. "I have come for justice, for the Emperor's will." Magnus stepped forward, each movement echoing through the hall. "Justice or vengeance? Tell me, Russ, did you come for my crimes, or because our father willed you to be his sword?" Russ's snarl was low, but his voice did not falter. "It does not matter. You broke his word. You endangered the Imperium. Prospero burns because of you." Magnus's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of his guilt. "I sought to save him. I sought to save us all, and now I pay the price." Russ's eyes narrowed. "Then you will pay it in full." The hall shook as the two brothers faced one another, the fires of Prospero casting their shadows against the walls. Outside, the wolves and the 1,000 suns fought on, but in that moment, all the battle seemed to narrow to the space between Russ and Magnus. The fate of Prospero would be decided here. The Pyramid of Photep trembled as two sons of the Emperor faced one another. Lem and Russ stood at the foot of the grand hall, frostblade in hand, his breath misting in the air. His eyes were sharp as the winter seas of Fenris, unshaken by the towering figure before him. Magnus the Red loomed above him, his crimson armor catching the light of the fires raging outside. His single eye burned like a star, his staff steady in his hand, but his voice was quiet, almost sorrowful. "Russ," Magnus said, "I will not fight you." Russ's reply was a snarl. "Then you will die." The Wolf King charged, his frost blade sweeping in a deadly arc. Magnus moved aside, his staff intercepting the blow in a crackle of psychic force. The impact sent a shockwave through the hall, shattering the mosaic tiles beneath their feet. Russ came at him again, each strike a storm of savage precision. Magnus parried each blow, his movements smooth, reluctant. His counterstrikes were measured, never killing blows, always meant to hold his brother at bay. Outside, the battle raged. The 1,000 suns still fought in the streets, their psychic might burning bright against the Space Wolves' relentless advance. But the city was crumbling. Whole districts collapsed under the bombardment from orbit. The mirrored spires of Tizca fell one by one, their glass shattering into storms of falling light. Inside the hall, Russ's fury only grew. "You dare hold back?" he roared, his blade carving deep into the marble. "Fight me, Magnus, or is this how you face judgment, cowering behind your excuses?" Magnus's voice was heavy with grief. "I will not kill my brother. I will not be the weapon our father has made of you." Russ's next strike caught Magnus across the chest, the frost blade biting deep. Crimson armor cracked, shards falling to the floor. Magnus staggered but did not fall. The Crimson King's single eye burned brighter. His voice, still calm, took on an edge of finality. "I will not kill you, Russ, but I will stop you." The air exploded with psychic force. A wave of raw power surged from Magnus, hurling Russ back across the hall. Pillars shattered, the walls cracking as the energy tore through them. Russ rolled to his feet, his blade still in hand, his teeth bared in a feral grin. "Now you fight!" The duel became a storm. Magnus's staff blazed with sorcerous light, arcs of power leaping with every swing. Russ's frost blade sang as it cut through wards and steel alike. They moved with the speed of demigods, each strike shaking the pyramid, each block echoing like thunder. Outside, the battle began to falter. The Thousand Suns' ranks thinned as the wolves pushed deeper. The psychic wards that had shielded the city flickered, collapsing one by one. The sky darkened under the smoke of burning towers, the once golden streets running red. Back in the hall, Russ found his opening. With a roar, he drove his blade forward, the frost weapon plunging deep into Magnus's side. The Crimson King staggered, his massive form bent, his staff falling from his grasp. His single eye dimmed, not from hatred, but from sorrow. Russ pulled the blade free. "Prospero falls today, brother." Magnus's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, it does." He stepped back, the floor beneath him cracking under the weight of his wounded form. His gaze swept the burning city beyond the balcony. His voice carried, heavy with finality. Then let it fall. In the warp, the skein shuddered as the final threads were cut. The pyramid of Photep trembled as psychic energy built to a breaking point. Russ stepped back, his blade ready, but Magnus did not strike again. Instead, the Crimson King's form shimmered with warp light, his body beginning to fade. With a final look at Russ, Magnus vanished into the immaterium. The Wolf King stood alone in the ruined hall, his frost blade dripping with blood. Outside, the wolves howled in triumph. The Thousand Suns lay broken, and Tizca burned. Prospero had fallen. The fires of Prospero burned for days. Where once the mirrored spires of Tizca had touched the sky, only jagged ruins remained. The streets were choked with ash. The crystal towers collapsed into shards that caught the dying light of the sun. The air was thick with the scent of scorched stone and charred flesh. The space wolves stood in the blackened plaza, where the pyramid of Photep had once dominated the skyline. Leman Russ looked over the ruin without triumph. His armor was rent and scorched, his frost blade dulled by the blood of battle. Around him, the wolves gathered, their howls subdued, their victory soured by the destruction they had wrought. "Gather the dead," Russ commanded. "Our own and theirs." The wolves moved without question. They did not revel in the ruin. This was not a feast, but an execution carried out in the Emperor's name. Above the planet, the wolves' fleet prepared to depart. Orbital bombardment had ceased, leaving the city smoldering in silence. The void was quiet now, the screams of battle replaced by the cold hum of departing ships. In the ashes of Tizca, the Thousand Suns were broken. Those who had survived the battle were few, wounded, captured, or scattered. The psychic wards that had once shielded the city lay in ruin, their power snuffed out. The people of Prospero, what remained of them, wandered the streets like shadows, their voices hushed, their eyes empty. Far away, in the imperial palace on Terra, the Emperor received the news in silence. Malcador stood at his side, the reports of Prospero's fall in his hands. "The wolves have completed their task," Malcador said quietly. "Magnus has fled. His legion is broken. Prospero burns." The Emperor's gaze was fixed upon the Webway portal. The light of the golden throne burned faintly, its power no longer for the expansion of mankind, but for the defense of the walls that Magnus's actions had compromised. "Magnus defied my command," the Emperor said at last, his voice quiet but cold. "And he has paid the price. His legion will bear the mark of his failure for as long as they endure." Malcador hesitated. "The Thousand Suns." "The Thousand Suns will never again stand as they did," the Emperor said. "Their home is gone. Their purpose is broken. Magnus's folly has stripped them of their place in the Imperium. On Prospero, the Wolves' fleet began its withdrawal. Russ stood aboard the Hrafnkel, watching the burning planet grow smaller in the viewport. His expression was unreadable. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, his trusted wolf guard, approached quietly. "It is done, my lord." Russ's voice was low. "It is never done, Bjorn. Not in the heart." He turned away, his thoughts heavy. He had carried out the Emperor's command, but it had been no simple act of justice. It had been a brother striking down a brother, and the bitterness of that wound would not heal. Back on the planet's surface, the ruins of Tizca stood in silence. Ash drifted through the streets, settling over shattered statues and burned libraries. The knowledge of Prospero, the wisdom of centuries, lay in blackened heaps, curling into dust. The surviving 1,000 sons gathered in secret, their numbers few. Ahriman stood among them, his armor scorched, his eyes burning with quiet resolve. "This is not the end," he said, his voice low but steady. "Prospero may burn, but the 1,000 sons endure. Magnus lives, and so do we." The others looked to him, weary but unbroken. They had lost their home, their brothers, their place in the Imperium, but the fire that had burned in their legion still smouldered. In the warp, far from Prospero, Magnus brooded in silence. His form was changed by his wound, his spirit marked by his defeat. He had failed to save his legion, failed to avert the Emperor's wrath, failed to protect his home. But his exile was not the end. The threads of fate still stretched before him, and in them Magnus saw paths yet to walk. Prospero had fallen, but the story of the Crimson King was far from over. The warp was silent around him. Magnus drifted through that endless ocean of thought and storm, his form a shadow of what it had been. His wound from Russ still ached, not in flesh, for such injuries meant little to a Primarch, but in spirit. Prospero was gone. The 1,000 suns were scattered, and the Emperor's light, which had once been the star by which Magnus navigated his fate, now burned cold against him. He sat in the depths of his mind, replaying the moments again and again. The wards shattering, the demons flooding the Webway, the look in Russ's eyes as the frost blade struck home. Each memory was a shard of glass, and he carried them all. Ahriman's voice echoed faintly through the warp. "My lord, the survivors gather. We need you." Magnus opened his single eye, gazing into the immaterium. He could see them, his broken legion, wandering the currents of the warp in fragments of fleets, seeking a place to call home. They waited for him. They still looked to him. But the Crimson King's voice was heavy when he answered, "I led you to ruin, Ahriman. What place is there for a king without a kingdom?" Ahriman's voice did not falter. "We are still your sons, and a king without a kingdom is still a king." Magnus fell silent. Far away in the imperial palace, the Emperor stood alone in the quiet of his private chamber. Malcador lingered at the edge, silent, watching his master's expression. "The Webway is sealed," Malcador said at last. "The breach contained. Terror is secure." The Emperor did not turn. His gaze was fixed on the distant stars, but his voice was softer than Malcador had heard in years. "Terror is secure, but the Imperium is not." Malcador studied him carefully. "You speak of Horus." "I speak of all my sons," the Emperor replied. "Magnus was not the first to fall. He will not be the last. The shadow grows. The skein of fate twists tighter." His words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken fear. On Prospero, the ashes cooled. The city of light had become a grave of glass and stone. Its libraries gone, its people scattered. The wind swept through the ruins, carrying with it whispers of what had been and what had been lost. Among the survivors in the warp, Ahriman gathered the remnants of the Thousand Suns aboard the battered remnants of their fleet. His voice was a steady anchor amid the chaos. Prospero burns. The Imperium casts us out. But we are not broken. We will find Magnus. We will find our path again. The warriors looked to him, their crimson armor scorched, their psychic power dimmed but not extinguished. They bore the weight of exile, but not defeat. In the warp, Magnus finally turned his gaze from the ruin of his thoughts. His single eye burned again, not with the pride of old, but with a quieter, sharper flame. He spoke, not just to Ahriman, but to all who still followed him. If we cannot walk the Emperor's path, we will walk our own. We are exiles, but we are not yet ended. The currents of the warp stirred, as if the very immaterium listened. On Terra, the Emperor stood at the balcony of the Imperial Palace, the light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the golden walls. His voice was quiet, meant only for himself. I could not save you, Magnus. Perhaps I could save none of you. The wind carried the words away, but in the warp, the storm was building. The warp was calm. Magnus stood upon a fragment of Prospero, not the true world, but an echo conjured from memory. Around him stretched the shining streets of Tisga as they had once been, the mirrored spires rising into the blue sky, the scent of the sea on the air. It was beautiful, but it was not real. He knew this was the last time he would walk these streets, even in memory. His single eye traced the familiar towers, the balconies from which he had once watched his legion train, the libraries where knowledge had burned like a living fire. In his mind's ear, he could still hear the voices of his sons, eager, proud, unbroken. But the streets were empty now. In the real galaxy, Prospero was ash. His legion was scattered, and he was an exile, his name cursed upon Terra. Ahriman's voice reached him through the warp. My lord, the legion awaits you. Where shall we go? Magnus did not answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the last sunset of the city he had loved. At last he turned. We go where the Imperium cannot follow. Prospero is no more, but the Thousand Suns live, and we will endure. Far away in the Imperial Palace, the Emperor sat upon the golden throne. The vast machinery of the Webway project now served only as a seal, holding the breach closed. His power flowed endlessly into the device, his mind always at work to keep the warp at bay. In the silence of his thoughts, he returned again and again to Prospero. He had loved Magnus, not as a father loves a son, but as a creator values his most brilliant work. Magnus had been his most gifted, his most dangerous, his most flawed. And now he was lost. Malcador approached quietly. The wolves have returned. Prospero is secure. Secure? The Emperor's voice was quiet. Number Prospero is gone, and a part of the Imperium is gone with it. He turned his gaze toward the stars. Somewhere out there, Magnus still lived. Somewhere out there, a sun still walked the galaxy in exile. In the warp, the Thousand Suns gathered. Their fleet drifted through the immaterium like ghosts, crimson hulls scarred by the fire of Prospero. Ahriman stood at the bridge of the flagship, watching as Magnus stepped into their midst. The Crimson King's form was changed, scarred but unbroken. His single eye swept over his warriors. You are exiles now, Magnus said, but you are still my sons. The Imperium may name you traitors, but you will endure. You will endure because you must. Ahriman bowed his head, and the legion followed. In the distance, Prospero's sun burned faintly in the warp. No longer a beacon of light, but a dying ember. Magnus turned away from it. On Terra, the Emperor's thoughts were heavy. One son lost, others endangered. The shadow of betrayal creeping closer with every passing day. The Webway gates were sealed, the palace was secure, but the cracks in the Imperium were spreading, and far across the galaxy, the Crimson King sailed into exile, carrying with him the grief of Prospero and the fire of what was yet to come. The city of light was gone. The ashes had scattered, but the echo of Prospero would haunt the Imperium for all eternity.